Robert Downey Jr. as Victor Von Doom. Tell me the Marvel Cinematic Universe is in trouble without telling me the Marvel Cinematic Universe ain't in trouble. Now available in paperback and e-readers. Isis, Amari's Revenge. The goddess next door is confronted by a Nubian queen out for revenge at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in this inaugural Isis series adventure. Get your copy of Isis, Amari's Revenge in paperback and e-readers at Amazon.com and online booksellers everywhere. Better get the cold slow, y'all, cause we're having us a barbecue. Marvel Studios announced that Robert Downey Jr. would be returning to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. At the San Diego Comic-Con, Kevin Feige and the executives at Disney who run Marvel Studios made an announcement that Robert Downey Jr., the man who led the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the first 3 phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, would be returning to this franchise. However, he would not be returning to the franchise in the iconic signature role that he played in the Marvel Cinematic Universe of Tony Stark and Iron Man that he played from 2008 to 2019. No, Robert Downey Jr. would be returning to the Marvel Cinematic Universe as Victor Von Doom, the villain who would be leading Phase 5, and would be the lead villain in the next 2 movies that come after Captain America Brave New World, which are going to be Avengers Doomsday and the Avengers Secret Wars. Now, this is a major turn for Marvel Studios, which had been having to deal with an issue as related to its overall franchise after terminating the man who they originally planned to be the lead villain in their Phase 5, that came out of Phase 4, and that man was actor Jonathan Majors, who was originally planned to play Kang the Conqueror. However, after Jonathan Majors got into a domestic violence incident with his then girlfriend Grace Jabari, where he was seen on video fleeing from Grace Jabari, who had been chasing him as related to this alleged domestic violence assault, Jonathan Majors wound up getting prosecuted by New York District Attorney Alvin Bragg for that domestic violence, and that basically led to Disney and Marvel Studios terminating his contract and left them with a major problem as related to the overall Marvel Cinematic Universe, Phase 4, and Phase 5. And this is an effort to try to regroup and try to get the Marvel Cinematic Universe back on track. Now, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been struggling ever since Avengers Endgame basically ended the 3rd phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and as Avengers Endgame basically ended the overall Infinity storyline of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has not been the dominant franchise it used to be back from the 2000s to the 2010s. No, in the 2020s, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has gone into a major state of decline because its lead heroes, such as Iron Man, died at the end of Avengers Endgame, and Captain America wound up getting aged out, and Marvel Studios thought it could go out here and transition to the all-new, all-different Marvel as related to making its adaptations, and as it transitioned from making the adaptations of classic Marvel stories to stories from the all-new, all-different Marvel, as it looked to establish its multiverse saga, the Marvel Cinematic Universe basically wound up starting to wane in popularity, starting with the 2019, or I believe 2020 film, Eternals, and ever since then it's been a road downhill as they've gone out here with from Eternals onward, a film that underperformed due to director Chloe Zhao's inexperience as related to superhero movies and the fact that the Eternals were not characters that viewers really knew or cared about. This was exacerbated in 2020 as Marvel Studios started to entered the streaming world with this Marvel TV series on Disney Plus. And while WandaVision was a strong show, many of the other shows that came afterward wound up struggling overall. And as they wound up struggling, what happened was the ratings on these shows really did not take off. And as they built these shows up, eventually when they got to starting to implement movies, they started to create movies that really didn't, that started a trend of underperforming. We had films like Thor, Love and Thunder, and Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Multiverse of Madness. These films, they basically brought some of the remaining characters back from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Unfortunately, these films really did not have that dynamic structure that the first three phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe had, where you could see how the story would sequence as related to building up a storyline. No, we never got that real build up, and that was one of the things that wound up starting to hurt the overall structure of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It started to hurt the overall structure of the Marvel Cinematic Universe because there was no way to link all of these events in a way that answered a critical question a screenwriter like myself has to ask, and that question is, why should we care? Why should the audience care now that the story with the characters they wanted was basically over? I mean, with the end of the Infinity Saga, there's really no reason to care because the characters people had invested in personally and emotionally were gone. Tony Stark was dead. Steve Rogers basically was gone as Captain America and been made an old man. And all we were left with were basically ancillary characters that really could not really drive any sort of story. So there was no real motive for the viewer and the audience to care about many of these other characters. And even worse, there was no plan to structure a build-up of characters that could get you interested in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I mean, you had Hawkeye basically passing his mantle on to this girl, and then you had other characters coming in like Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel, who basically is a creatively totaled character who nobody cared about and basically had the ratings to show it. And this basically culminated in the climax with the She-Hulk Attorney at Law series. I mean, outside of WandaVision and the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, there really wasn't much reason to care, and the build-up basically started to go from building a structure of storylines that made you care to storylines that made you apathetic, and this apathy basically started to see the box office for Marvel Studios movies start to go from underperforming to becoming box office flops, and the first of those box office flops featured its lead villain, Jonathan Majors, in Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, and Quantumania was the first Marvel Studios flop, and as related to its MCU movies, and this was further exacerbated as we saw other Marvel Cinematic Universe movies wind up flopping at the box office. We saw after Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, we saw the other MCU movies that wound up flopping, such as The Marvels, and after The Marvels wound up flopping, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is in a place that puts it in actual danger as a franchise, because when you have two movies fail at the box office, that's when executives start to get nervous, and a lot of people at Marvel Studios are starting to get nervous to the point where they're starting to get desperate, and the decision to cast Robert Downey Jr. as Dr. Doom and Victor Von Doom basically is something that is being done out of desperation to try to salvage the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And what's being done here is no different than what happened with the late Christopher Reeve, when he tried to save the Superman franchise, which basically wound up going in a bad direction due to Warner Brothers executives interfering with Richard Donner. Richard Donner had the Superman franchise going on a good track with the first Superman, the movie, and Superman 2. Unfortunately, in the middle of Superman 2, Richard Donner was fired and Richard Lester was hired. And as Richard Lester was hired, the producers, the Salkins, wanted to put more comedy in a Superman movie. And as they put more comedy in a Superman movie, they cast Richard Pryor opposite the late Christopher Reeve, and what we got was one of the biggest disasters as related to a superhero movie franchise in Superman 3, a film that still boggles people's minds outside of one sequence where the late Christopher Reeve brilliantly showed how great the character was and how great an actor he was, where Superman fought Clark Kent. The only good thing to come out of that entire movie, which was just a hot mess, I remember being 10 years old and being at the RKO Fordham and basically saying this was a terrible movie at 10 years old. And this movie, again, basically was the template for failure. And it looks like Marvel Studios is on the same road with its Marvel Cinematic Universe by casting Robert Downey Jr. as Doctor Doom, because this casting was basically done to shock all of fandom, made to shock all of fandom into believing that this was going to be something controversial. However, the controversy did not work the way that he expected to get people excited. No. Unlike the situation with the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, where we had a mystery as related to the White Ranger, and then we found out it was Tommy, what happened in this case was we weren't as excited as those Power Rangers fans were when they found out that Tommy was going to be the White Ranger. No, what happened here was that Robert Downey Jr. being announced as Victor Von Doom basically was something that basically showed us how desperate Kevin Feige is to get the Marvel Cinematic Universe back on track, but his desperation basically further accelerated the situation of showing us how Marvel Studios really is not in a good place to get the Marvel Cinematic Universe back on track after it got derailed as far back as 2019 with the start of Phase 4 with Eternals, a film that never should have been greenlit, because the Eternals really didn't work organically into a multiverse plan. And I just asked myself the critical question about Eternals. Where do they fit into the Marvel Cinematic Universe? I mean, they don't really fit into the multiverse storyline, and they don't really fit into the Infinity storyline. So why was this film greenlit and made? That's a critical question I've got to ask, because when I look at that film, and I look at this Academy Award-winning director, Chloe Zhao, her style really didn't fit into the overall dynamics of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and the film Eternals basically started the end of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which really started again its state of decline, because Kevin Feige really didn't have that focus and direction in order to start a second story arc. Usually when a writer starts out again with a second story arc, this is where you can build on the momentum of the existing story. Unfortunately, with Kevin Feige, I guess he didn't know what to do, and then eventually decided to start doing what he called a multiverse saga. A multiverse saga that once it started to get its momentum, never really got its legs, because as we started to see the building block of the Marvel Cinematic Universe's multiverse saga, which was supposed to start in Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, the problem with the whole situation was they did not have a lead character to be the guide for that series. No, they didn't have a lead character to be the guide of that series the way Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark was, because Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark basically was the guide who took us all the way through the Marvel Cinematic Universe's first three phases, from first story to last. He was there from Iron Man to Avengers Endgame, and that's where his story ended. And once his story ended, the Marvel Cinematic Universe's story basically was over. And instead of looking to build a new character to be the lead character, what Marvel Studios did was throw random characters at us, not understanding the importance of a main character. Because as a writer, I understand the importance of a main character because the main character is the lead of the story. And as the lead of the story, they guide the reader all throughout the storyline, all the way to the conclusion. And without a lead character, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was a rudderless ship. A rudderless ship because they didn't want to go out and make Black Panther the new lead character of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. No, Marvel Studios could have basically rectified the situation even with the passing of Chadwick Boseman by making the Black Panther the lead character and possibly going out here and doing something with Wakanda Forever, and recasting T'Challa. Now, I was against recasting T'Challa because that was the role that I believe Chadwick Boseman made iconic at the time. And sadly, that the whole thing is that they didn't have a plan to do something about that, because what their original plan was, they were going to make Captain Marvel the lead character, but Captain Marvel really didn't work in that role because Captain Marvel was a film that most comic fans panned and only watched because of the Infinity Saga, and Captain Marvel really wasn't that much of an interesting character. But they could have made Doctor Strange the lead character in the Marvel Cinematic Universe as related to this whole multiverse thing, or they could have made Ant-Man a lead character, but sadly, Kevin Feige didn't focus on that major story element, and that's the major reason why the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a mess, because there was no plan to create a lead character to be the guide after Tony Stark died. And now what they want to do is throw this Hail Mary where they have Robert Downey Jr. return as Victor Von Doom, but I don't think it's going to work because, yes, Robert Downey Jr. is now an Academy Award-winning actor after his brilliant performance in Oppenheimer, but even with his great range, I don't see him as Victor Von Doom. No, I don't see him as being that Eastern European man with that kind of arrogance and presence that Doctor Doom had. No, all I'm going to see with him being Victor Von Doom is basically him playing an evil version of Tony Stark, and Tony Stark and Victor Von Doom are two completely different characters. No, when it comes to Victor Von Doom is way more formal than Tony Stark. He's way more serious than Tony Stark, and he's very aloof and very distant and cold. And the play Victor Von Doom is, again, something that I don't see Robert Downey Jr. in that role. No, I see his co-star in Oppenheimer, Cillian Murphy, in that role. And Cillian Murphy would be a way better Victor Von Doom. And an announcement of Cillian Murphy as Victor Von Doom would have gone over better than Robert Downey Jr. because Robert Downey Jr. returning as Victor Von Doom just doesn't work as related to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. No, it really comes across as a really sloppy decision and a poor decision based on what Ham Saban did with Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, and really shows how the standards have dropped, because in Ham Saban's situation, I could understand because he was working with low budgets, and with Haim Saban, basically what he was looking to do, as he built suspense, he already knew that Jason David Frank was over with fans. He already knew, Jason David Frank was already one of the big players, and he already knew that Jason David Frank, the late Jason David Frank, basically had a following. So the decision to make him go from being the very popular Green Ranger to becoming the White Ranger in Season 2, this basically was a no-brainer because Tommy was already popular. So that decision was a good decision because it came organically out of the story of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, because Tommy had already lost his powers as related to being the Green Ranger due to them running out of toy footage. So after they ran out of Japanese footage with the Green Ranger, it was a no-brainer to bring Tommy back as the White Ranger. But in the case of bringing Robert Downey Jr. back as Iron Man, from not Iron Man but Doctor Doom. You see, already subconsciously, I'm already getting mixed up. You already see that this is a bad decision. Most people know Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man and Tony Stark, and the decision to bring him back in this way is an unmitigated disaster. An unmitigated disaster that basically won't save the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because the Marvel Cinematic Universe already is in a bad place, having 2 box office flops, with Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania having a box office flop in the Marvels, and will be guaranteed to have a flop with Captain America: Brave New World, because Captain America: Brave New World cost $375 million and will need $1.5 billion to just break even, and need to make $2 billion to make a profit. And that film is not going to make that $2 billion, basically because Anthony Mackie is not a lead actor, 1. 2, the trailer for Captain America: Brave New World didn't show us anything new and exciting. And 3, the trailer shows us how this doesn't really work in the overall multiverse saga. No, this film basically is going to be an unmitigated disaster, which basically puts Kevin Feige's job on the line. Because as someone who's studied the entertainment industry for over 25 years, I can tell you, if you have 3 box office failures, you as an executive are going to be on the road to termination, because they can understand 1 box office failure as a mistake. They can even understand 2 as the possible start of a trend that shows that a genre is declining. But when you have 3 box office failures, that's where people look at that executive and the decisions that they make. They look at the decisions that person is making, and that's where they start to say, this person, it's time for them to be terminated, because this person really isn't taking us in a good direction. And when it comes to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they're going in a bad direction that basically will lead to Doomsday, because Avengers Doomsday, I believe, will be an unmitigated disaster, because it will have things that I know are really a problem as related to film. One of them is that they possibly are going to have a rushed screenplay that will be very sloppy, and that screenplay will not really be one that plays to the strengths of Robert Downey Jr., and similar to with the situation they're having with the film Blade, where they just can't seem to get a script written, and they can't really get a script written because the source material that they're looking to possibly play from are stories from the past the 2000s, where Marvel went into a creative state of decline. Marvel hasn't been good since about 2001, when writers like Kurt Busiek and artists like George Perez, who were veterans, wound up leaving, and they started to bring in new people. And this is where Joe Quesada wound up taking over Marvel. And when you go into that era and think about what they're going to adapt, I don't really think that they can adapt anything good, because they've tried to adapt all new, all different Marvel, and most of the stories past 2001 are just not that good. So Robert Downey Jr., basically, you're putting a solid performer in a situation where he's dealing with crap material, and that crap material, basically, I believe, is going to be the reason why this whole casting is going to be a disaster. Because the disaster really started because Kevin Feige, really as an executive, didn't have any focus for his vision for the second story arc, something that I know as a writer, again, that second story arc is essential in building momentum. That's something I had to do on the ISIS series and the Esteem series. Now, on the ISIS series, I started the first 7 stories from Amari's Revenge to All About the Goddess to establish Isis as a character. And as I was doing that, I was building up to her meeting up with John Haynes and creating a corner in the SJS Direct universe. And I understood that I needed to take my time and build that momentum for the first story arc to go into the second story arc. And I understood that the second story arc is where you really start to hook people in. And as I did the second story arc and started from the ISIS meeting John Haynes to them forming a relationship as related to interacting with each other, I slowly started to build. And again, this is how I started to build the audience for the ISIS series, because I understood that the second story arc is essential, but Kevin Feige didn't have that vision. No, he had tunnel vision as related to the Infinity Saga, and he didn't understand that, yes, once you finished a story arc, you have to go out here and start laying elements for your next story arc. You have to, as you're building your first story arc that establishes the characters, you have to pay that off. And as you pay that off, you have to start laying the foundation for your next story arc. And as you build that story arc, that second story arc is essential, because that's where you're going to get the really start to build your audience globally overall. That's when you're going to start to build your audience. And you have to really be careful about how you build, because if you go out here and make a mistake to get a quick payoff like what Kevin Feige did, what you're going to do is go out here and mess up your entire structure for storytelling. And that's what Kevin Feige did. Yes, at the end of the Infinity Saga, he killed Tony Stark. But once he killed Tony Stark, he basically killed his ability to tell stories. This is what Jon Favreau told Kevin Feige and told us all. He said, once you kill Tony Stark, you basically have killed the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and bringing Robert Downey Jr. back isn't going to do it, because Tony Stark is the character that basically is leading the story, was the guide for audiences, and was the friend that people connected with. It was Tony Stark that was the character that people cared about. And once people heard that Robert Downey Jr. was coming back as Victor Von Doom, this is where people realized that there's nothing to care about, and many people started to see the desperation of Kevin Feige. We started to see the desperation of Kevin Feige, because the decision to, again, change things up because of the arrest of Jonathan Majors and the conviction on domestic violence, to change us from Kang to Doctor Doom, that puts us in a situation where all of Phase 4 was absolutely a waste of time, and doesn't give us much confidence as related to Phase 5, because basically you've gone from a series that's basically going nowhere to basically you're telling me that everything that I watched for the last 4 years was just a waste of time, and now you want to try to get the series back on track. But there's no way to get the series back on track because the storylines are just jumbled. And while comic book fans are used to this, I mean, I was used to this back in the late 80s with Chris Claremont, when he basically was in a state of a creative rut on X-Men, where I had to deal with all of this nonsense of alternate realities and characters coming from different timelines. Yeah, that stuff, Chris Claremont was able to get away with that stuff because it was comic books. But in the world of the medium of film, people are not as receptive to things like the alternate realities and timelines and stuff like that. No, in the world of film, basically, when you tell a story, everything in that story is considered to be canon. And when you make things hard to watch, what happens is that people just stop caring, because if you have all of these different things like alternate realities and time travelers, again, these are the plot devices of a bad writer who is desperate to get a story going, a writer who basically has run out of ideas, and is out of concepts to come up with. This is where a writer basically is in a place where they're just trying to just throw crap at a wall and hope something sticks. But the whole thing is that the crap that Kevin Feige is throwing at this wall is not going to stick. Not going to stick at all, because this whole structure that he's got basically is just, it's extremely rickety as related to storytelling. This is something I know as a writer, because I was basically in the same place around 2002. I remember around 2002, after writing the first ISIS in 1999, I wanted to rush out and write Amari's Revenge. I wanted to write it back then, but I thank God that I didn't. And what I did was I basically had to wait all the way till 2012 to have a plot for Amari's Revenge. And eventually, by that point, I had become a much better writer. I had become a lot better as related to my craft. And when I wrote ISIS Amari's Revenge in 2012, it was a much better story. Same thing with The Temptation of John Haynes back in about 2005. I wrote that story and I published it in 2011. And I wanted to rush to the keyboard to write the sequel, which was going to be The Man Who Rules the World. And originally that story was going to feature The Block versus John Haynes, but I realized that a drug dealer versus a CEO was again a ridiculous story, so I shelved that story, and I didn't get back to that story until about 15 or so, when my mother was in the hospital, and that's when I wrote The Man Who Rules the World. And after that, again, just took that time. I mean, it took me, again, another 10 years to wait to write that story. And that story was considered to be one of the best stories in the SJS Direct universe. I understood that, again, creating stories takes time. And sometimes you just need a break as related to characters. You need a break that gives you some perspective on things before you put your fingers to the keyboard. And that's what Kevin Feige didn't understand. He doesn't understand that, yeah, maybe we need to rest the MCU for a couple of years. We need to rest the MCU so that we're not rushing out product. But the bean counters over at Disney, what they want is big box office. They want big box office, but unfortunately, in this case, what they're doing is basically undermining themselves and sabotaging themselves. They're undermining themselves and sabotaging themselves because you're rushing to get movies out to keep the MCU what you believe to be relevant. But what would make the MCU relevant is just taking time to craft some stories that basically give us a reason to care about these characters, because rushing stories out like this and rushing out things and hoping a shock casting like Robert Downey Jr. will get people excited. This is the kind of moves that, again, desperate people make. And again, when you do things out of desperation, people really don't have a reason to care because you're not showing how much you care. No, what you're doing is what nice guys do in trying too hard. And when you try too hard, what happens is people can see you trying too hard and overcompensating by using things like CGI and using things like stunt casting to cover up a weak script. And that's basically what I see happening here with the return of Robert Downey Jr., which could have easily been done by saying that the effects of the Infinity Gems eventually wore off Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man, and eventually this resurrection of Tony Stark basically led to Tony Stark basically coming back to life. You could have done something like that. Or you could have said that Victor Von Doom basically wound up snatching Tony Stark outside of time and put a Doombot in his place or something like that. There was an organic way to get out of that thing. But with this whole multiverse saga, there's no real reason to care, because if you create a multiverse, there's no reason to care about characters, because their stories basically are invalidated, because you can just go get an alternate version to replace the current version. And that's what Kevin Feige possibly wants to do to get the MCU back on track. But that's not going to work, because in the world of film, alternate realities, again, are not something people take seriously. They don't take it seriously because that really shows that the writer doesn't care. And again, the MCU is in a very dire place, a dire place that Kevin Feige knows that he's in, because at this place they're looking at him suspect and looking at him and pondering taking his job, because it's clear things aren't working for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it's not working because Kevin Feige basically got his head gassed up to the point where he thought he could go on forever. This is a mistake that many studio executives make when they're not seasoned, because a seasoned studio executive understands that there's going to be an end point. And once there's an end point, this is where you have to make a plan to leave on top. You have to make a plan to leave on top and then go someplace else. That's what a smart, seasoned studio person understands. They understand, once I get the success, it's time for me to just resign my position and start looking for other opportunities. That's where Kevin Feige made his mistake as related to business, as related to his career. I mean, when it comes to an executive who was out here, or somebody who knows the entertainment industry, you know to go out on top. Go out on top as having the #1 movie as related to Avengers Endgame, and use that to parlay into your next job, because in Hollywood, you're only good as your last job. And with the Avengers Doomsday, it's basically doomsday for Kevin Feige. Doomsday because his whole career will basically be over with the failure of Captain America Brave New World, which will be the end of the world for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And Doomsday will basically be the cherry on the top of a crap cake covered with diarrhea icing and dingleberries, basically turning one of the greatest franchises in history into a pile of crap, because that's what's happening to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as Kevin Feige got too cocky, got too sloppy, and basically put his whole franchise and his career into a downward trajectory. And the decision to announce Robert Downey Jr. as Dr. Doom basically is a bookend as related to the fall of a franchise, where we went from the revival of Robert Downey Jr.'s career in 2008 with Iron Man to basically winding up on a path to him basically having one of the biggest failures of his career, because again, I don't see him as Dr. Doom. I don't see Dr. Doom fitting into this jumbled storyline that was not structured very well as related to the phase 4 and fail 5, phase 5. I just see an epic failure created by the greed and delusions of studio executives who never really studied how the business works. And because they didn't study how the business works, they're about to take Disney on a road to bankruptcy. Yeah, they made a lot of money with Inside Out too, but the whole problem is that they're not really creating new concepts, which they should have been doing even before Avengers Endgame, because any seasoned studio executives, they would understand, look, this MCU franchise is on its way to concluding its story. Let's get some new stuff out here. Let's get some new concepts out here. But again, these boomer executives are so greedy and don't want to share the wealth with new creators like myself to create new concepts. Don't want to share the wealth with new creators to create new concepts. So what they would rather do is go out here and throw out some rehash of rehash. And again, this is why they're struggling right now. And again, because they're struggling and losing money, what they want to do is go out here and rush out Robert Downey Jr., hoping people will get caught up in their feelings of nostalgia as related to his success on Iron Man. But what we see here is that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has a serious case of bad rust. Bad rust because executives don't have a vision to build those second story arcs. Again, the second story arc is essential for building a world as related to a fantasy, essential as related to cementing a universe, because what you're doing in the first phase is, again, establishing the characters, establishing the conflict, but the second story arc is where you really start to establish the character's transformation arc, and all of that was cut off because Kevin Feige basically went for a shock turn with the death of Tony Stark. And with the death of Tony Stark, we started to see the MCU start to die, and Robert Downey Jr.'s return as Dr. Doom basically dooms the MCU, because it shows the death of ideas, the death of creativity, the death of imagination, the death of storytelling. That's what we see over at Marvel Studios, because at this point, the MCU basically is going on to a road to an ignominious path that has killed many other franchises, where executives basically bungled the landing, and basically as they bungle the landing, they basically lead to their franchises crashing and burning. Now, if you want to pick up my first full comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, you can find that comic now on Kindle for a price. And you can also get the paper copy on Lulu.com by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try out my first digital comic, A Steam No Good Deed, you can find that comic on Kindle for 99 cents. And if you want to check out all of the books of the SJS Direct Universe, like those in the ISIS series, those in the Esteem series, those in the John Haynes series, And other titles like those in the Spinsterella trilogy and Eternal Night and my business novel Recipe for Success, you can find those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them at other online booksellers like Drafted Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and big box retailers like Walmart and Target. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Esteem Horror in the Hamptons. The aspiring angel tries to escape a house of horrors in this action-packed, all-new Esteem series adventure. Get your copy of Esteem Horror in the Hamptons in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Dark Incubus. The goddess next door gets enthralled in a romantic entanglement with an evil incubus in this all-new Isis series adventure. Get your copy of Isis, Dark Incubus in paperback and e-readers today. Now available in paperback and e-readers, John Haynes' Illuminati. The man who rules the world takes on the head of the global elite in this all-new action-packed John Haynes series adventure. Get your copy of John Haynes' Illuminati in paperback and e-readers at Amazon.com and online booksellers everywhere. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.